And we should be going. There we go. All right. So, Larry, thanks so much for being interested and willing to join me in this reshoring conversation. Looking forward to being able to work with you guys and do some joint marketing on this potentially. As you know, we are recording this, and so we will send you a copy of the file if you want it when we're done. Any questions or anything like that we need to cover before we start, or I'm going to jump in?
No, I'm excited. Let's do it.
All right. So the first question that we're looking to talk about today are what trends are you seeing relative to offshoring and reshoring in the last few years?
So I think there's kind of a pre-COVID and a COVID conversation. So pre-COVID, there was always discussion about reshoring, but probably more I should say less discussion about offshoring. We weren't seeing or we weren't losing as much work to overseas markets as we had in the early 2000s or even the late 1990s. So pre-COVID, it was just kind of quiet. We weren't seeing a lot of requests for information. It just kind of was the standard to move things over there. There wasn't really any other directives that we could see from corporate. Now, since COVID, there has been a significant uptick in, I'll call it requests for information, not quite to the request for quote or order stage. So I think, you're starting to see directives from corporate leaders, even legislators saying, how can we do this? How can we bring this back? And that's where they're starting to see, where the gaps really are.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, nothing really converting quite yet, but there is a significant interest. It's pretty much all day long emails and calls from people we haven't talked to in decades.
Are you seeing anything in like the request for information that you're talking about? Are you seeing a trend around like company size, smaller companies, bigger companies, or?
Well, I think there's an organizational level of maturity in large corporations, or maybe even smaller, small to medium size that are beyond the startup phase, that have mature products, mature engineering, mature supply chain managers that understand how to go about setting up or reestablishing domestic supply chains. So we're definitely seeing it with just a maturity level, not so much the size and not so much an industry yet either.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. Okay. What about, let's see, look at the next question here. Following the initial impact of the global pandemic, so going back to the COVID comment you were saying and shutdown, and I think that you've actually just already answered this, but following the initial impact of COVID and the shutdown, have you seen a noticeable change in the interest to reshore? So I think you've already answered that, but
yeah, I mean, there's no doubt it's there. We're seeing it again, legislators, corporate directives, buyers, and there's still a struggle and they're trying to figure out how to navigate that. But I think there's definitely a resurgence in interest.
Do you think that we're going to start seeing like legislation and things like that might, I mean, we've seen the tariffs and everything like that, which we kind of thought might have kicked off a little bit reshoring. I saw that just reshuffling of the cards in Asia is what I saw. But do you think like there might be legislation or incentives or tax incentives and things like that for people to be reshoring, or?
Yeah, sure. So we have been hearing about it. We're following some developments there. There's talk about permanently changing the Section 179. There's initiatives that you see even with I don't remember the name of the company, Arizona semiconductor manufacturer. They got quite a bit of incentives to move and build a facility in Arizona. So we're definitely seeing that from the legislative standpoint. But ultimately, it's a consumer issue if you kind of boil it down to what it is. So we'll see what comes out of this. But there's clearly at the national level, at a minimum, some movement there to create legislation around it.
Yeah. So I know that we were chatting a little bit before we got on the call here about just the uptick in business that you've seen. I'm assuming that wasn't necessarily related to new companies that are reshoring, but just the uptick in business. Have there been any, I mean, you said, did you get any customers that have wanted to like do any quotes like that, or is it just mostly RFI?
Still seems to be mostly RFI. However, we do have a customer that's new to us within the last year. They were vertically integrated prior to that, and there was a directive at that time to vacate some space that they were taking and get out of the vertically integrated manufacturing they're doing in-house. And as I understand it, they were getting some direction to move a lot of their internal production overseas. We got involved in that RFQ process. There were several stages of it. The first stage we won pretty quick. Second stage was quite a bit more competitive with overseas. They really wanted to have that made in USA label on it, not just assembled in USA. So we were real aggressive on it, and it just turned out to be a good fit. And so maybe not an order of reshoring, but definitely stopped some offshoring. So I'm proud of that.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on that. Let's see, the next question I have. What are you seeing any reluctance towards reshoring? Is it just as simple as cost, or are there other supply chain issues?
Price and cost is still king. It just is what it is. There's not much we can do about it. Now, I think the reluctance that we're seeing is probably more centered around the lack or the dwindled supply chains that we have in the US that we've lost over the last 3 decades. I mean, we're still very capable, but the collaboration and the supply chains, especially in special processes, our supply chain is quite simple. It's sheet metal, it's powder coating, plating, painting. That's not too difficult. But what we're starting to see is more value-added box build kind of product request for information. And when you start getting to that, that's where we're starting to see some of the struggle and a reluctance to move back, because our pricing structure is not quite right, because we're shipping parts all over. And especially in Denver, not a manufacturing hub, but a lot of those resources aren't available to us. So we're shipping, to multiple states. So the freight costs have added into the piece cost. So again, piece price variance and that cost, that's where the struggle seems to truly be.
Interesting. Are you starting to respond to that in your business around providing additional value-added services? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we are exploring some different opportunities there. Things that we are doing with outside special processes now. I think some of the difficulty that reshoring is going to run into is and these are good things, is environmental controls. Clearly, we have very good and stringent environmental controls here for the right reasons, and maybe those aren't as strict outside the U.S. So I think that's difficult to bring some of those processes internally here without a significant bump in business and CapEx. I think what I'm seeing though is truly a resurgence of collaboration. I mean, we're getting calls from, honestly, competitors that I haven't really ever talked to, or very seldom if it's maybe just at a customer meeting. Hey, how can we do this together? What can you do? How can we share resources? Resources like automation engineers, resources like HR. For small companies, those are difficult to have. So, not only just supply chain, but the resources available to us to grow with the customers that are needing our services now, again, in the U.S.
That is really interesting. I hadn't thought about that you would have some growth amongst your competitors and trying to figure out how to leverage each other's strengths in order to win business, maintain business, or what have you. Yeah.
I'm definitely seeing it, and again, nothing's really come to fruition yet, but it's great just to have these conversations that you're kind of all alone before, and now there's some really fun conversations and access to customers that I probably wouldn't have had without that collaboration.
That's great. It's good to hear that there's that maybe COVID is starting to help maybe more this working together part or something. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Do you have an example of someone that you've had reshore, and can you share what your experience was around that new customer or returning customer?
So I'll talk to you about one that was RFI and started to get into RFQ, has not moved forward yet, but essentially they were a bakeware manufacturer. Actually, they were a bakeware reseller here in the U.S. Volumes were not astronomical. They were decent by any small business measurement, but they were not so large that it was something we could jump right into. What we found through that process was the manufacturer that they were buying their product from overseas was actually building and manufacturing that exact same product for dozens of other resellers in the US. So when this one customer's product maybe wasn't great at 10,000 a year or 100,000 a year, when you add it 10 or 12 other customers, now you're talking in the millions. Okay, now you have an argument for CapEx. So as we were trying to just communicate with this one customer, I don't know all the other folks that they were selling it to or that were using the same manufacturer. And that's where we're seeing a lot of difficulty as well. There seems to be a lot of that kind of supply chain setup overseas where someone develops a product, they send it overseas to have it built, and then that product is built for multiple customers or multiple resellers, getting that economy of scale. We just couldn't find a way to make it work on just their volume.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting way of doing business. It's obviously different than how we think about it here in the States, where companies will own that intellectual property, and we wouldn't really even dream of selling that exact same product to one of their competitors. So it is definitely a different approach that I don't think a lot of startup companies or young companies that are maybe inexperienced with working overseas realize that in many ways is just how business is done. So yeah, and I think, go ahead.
Our equipment here too, is, as a contract manufacturer or a job shop, our equipment is really super diverse, and we try to be able to adapt it and modify that to run a significantly diverse product set. That bakeware product, you could tell, because I was able to look up that manufacturer, when they're making that many, this was a dedicated set of equipment that essentially never changed over. So again, could we build those parts here? You bet. And as we broke down the pricing structure for it, if I had the dedicated equipment for it, our pricing wasn't that far off. I'd say we were within, if I recall, probably about 15%. And I think their target was a 10 to 15% variance they would be willing to move with, except there was a significant CapEx investment to get there.
Right.
And they couldn't afford to help us with that, of course. So.
Right. And I think that's one thing too that differentiates kind of how business is done in the US versus offshore, is that you're very used to having to do multiple setups on a machine either during a day or during a week, probably during a week. But you don't have dedicated equipment. In fact, I think that, do you have any equipment, or have you heard of other customers or other competitors that have dedicated equipment for customers?
In at least our contract manufacturing or job shop world and competitors that I know, I don't really know of any that have dedicated equipment. Not that I can think of, at least.
Shared across multiple customers is generally what you're saying, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Have you noticed any specific industries that are more interested in reshoring versus offshoring?
Well, I think you're hearing the headlines, a lot of medical device manufacturing, pharmaceutical, clearly defense has always had some mandates there. And I think there's a renewed interest in really focusing on that. There was, some instances over the last couple of years of things kind of sneaking around and getting some information. So I see it there. Not quite seeing it in the consumer goods yet. Not that that's really, well, I think because of the overseas competition, that hasn't been a market that we've gone after. We've been mostly industrial, use within the US. However, that project that we won from going offshore, that is a forward customer facing retail product. So I can't say that there's any specific industry that's really targeting yet.
We'll have to see where this goes over the next several months, I guess. And so, is there anything else on your mind with respect to COVID, manufacturing, reshoring that you'd want to share with us?
Well, I think, as awful as it sounds, COVID is truly an opportunity for us domestically. I mean, it really is. I know a lot of people are hurting and really having a tough time, especially in the service industry. In our industry in manufacturing, we've been hiring pretty much through this whole process, haven't really slowed down much. We had a little scare early on, but that seemed to just go away within about a month and really has ramped up considerably. But as I look at this whole situation we're in, and I think we mentioned briefly earlier, I think this is a consumer problem. I mean, the consumers are the ones that are demanding the prices. It's not the CEOs, it's not the corporations, the evil corporations. It's truly the consumer. So I think it's going to have, for this to continue, for onshoring, reshoring, stopping offshoring, for industrial through that process, consumers, legislators, we're all going to have sacrifices, some commitment to, really seeking out American-made products. And I think as a manufacturer, we really have got to focus on how to drive efficiencies in our cost structure. And I think, more importantly, we have to live up to name that we've had for decades, which is quality. And so if consumers are going to demand, or if consumers are going to pay more for a product, it had better be perfect. And so I think we all have to live up to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I was just thinking as you were talking about how here a few years back in the restaurant industry, how there was the legislation in Colorado to bump the minimum wage up for servers from $2 or $3 an hour plus tips to whatever minimum wage is and the ramp is. And a lot of that conversation was also very consumer centric around how the prices in restaurants and things like that were going to go up. And I think we've seen that in Colorado, but I don't think it's been as bad. And it's interesting when you're talking about the consumer ultimately is demanding lower prices. If there's some parallels between what happened in the restaurant industry, if that would happen in consumer products as well. I have you frozen on my screen. I'm going to shut my camera off just in case it's a bandwidth issue. I don't know.
Hey.
I'm getting you back. And there you are. Say words. Can you hear me? You can't hear me. Okay. I don't know. Anyway, well, thank you.